Welcome to Grome House Museum's podcast, At Home with the Picts, A Crafted Legacy. I am your host, storyteller Eileen Budd, and throughout this podcast I will be taking you on a journey with me around Scotland and beyond, exploring Grome House Museum's collection, speaking to contemporary craftspeople, artists and musicians whose work uses the same or similar techniques to the Picts. In this podcast, we will meet stone carvers, weavers and carnix players. We will speak to academics, archaeologists and blacksmiths, and together explore how the Picts lived and how they made their art. Because, as George Bain once said, theory may inform, but practice convinces. The food episode. One of the most important foods in Scottish folk tradition is the bannock, a type of bread or biscuit often made with oats. We have special kinds of bannocks for every occasion, from childbirth to celebrating changes in the seasons, and you've maybe heard the Scottish folk story about the wee bannock who jumped out of the pan and ran down the road being chased by a whole stream of people wanting to eat him. There's also a folk story about the Picts being the inventors of a delicious ale brewed from heather, and so wonderful was this drink that the Scots fought and chased the Picts to get the recipe. But the story goes that the last Pict leapt from a high cliff and took the secret recipe with him to his grave to prevent the Scots from ever making Pictish heather ale. Food is central to our health, folklore, culture and survival. And so exploring what the Picts were growing, cooking and eating can tell us a lot about who they were as a people. And so I went through to Glasgow to interview food historian Peter Gilchrist about Pictish food.
My name is Peter Gilchrist and I run a Tenement kitchen where I investigate the history of Scottish food history. I like to focus on working class food history. A lot of what I'm doing at the moment is Victorian history, but I really believe that to kind of understand food culture you have to look into the past. So I spent a lot of time looking at some of the origins of our feasts and holidays, some of the things we don't celebrate anymore, some of the ingredients we don't cook with anymore. So I'm very excited to talk about the Picts.
Fantastic, I'm so pleased to be able to talk to you as well. And we are talking in the middle of Macintosh at the Willow. Perfect. So, the Picts and what they ate.
Yeah.
What do you think that they were eating? What would be available to them?
Yeah. Well, if we are assuming that they were impacted by the ancestors in the land before, then we know that they were eating things like deer, veal, beef, lamb, mutton, goats. These things were around in Neolithic times in Scotland. And hunting was definitely a big part of Pictish life. We see that reflection on Pictish stones. I think you have to, as I'm sure you will have kind of explored through your other interviews, like Pictish culture is like a complex civilization where there's wealth disparity, there's hierarchy, there's monarchy. Not everyone is eating the same thing, and they're not eating it for the 600 odd years that they were living in Scotland. So we're going to kind of traffic in some generalizations today, but perhaps kind of jump into some of what we found through archaeology, some of what we can assume through folklore, and what we have kind of evidence-based that we can kind of jump off from.
So firstly, what can we tell from archaeology, food archaeology surrounding the Picts?
Well, there's some really interesting findings that actually came through in October of last year, which is 4 or 5 months ago. This is all hot off, for archaeology, this is hot off the press. So there was a study that was done around some Pictish digs, and what they found in the Pictish digs was pottery, and they examined the starches that they found on that pottery and examined the way that those starches had been cooked. So if something is dry fried, if it's heated on a fire, if it's boiled, if it's fermented, the starches break apart in a different way. So they were able to get really in depth. And what essentially they found is that kind of the main modes of cookery was things like boiling, parching, which is where you dry things with a really dry heat. So it might be directly on a fire stone. It might be leaving things in the sun if it's an incredibly sunny day to let them dry out. Or fermentation is another big one. So not a million miles away from how we're cooking farther into the Middle Ages, farther into kind of our more recent Scottish history, boiling, fermenting, drying things out. That really is Scotland's main methods of cookery. It's still in many parts of Scotland.
I mean, we know that they were hunting, but there is a theory. Current theory suggests that they were also farming. So they were also agricultural people.
We believe that they were eating things like legumes, but there isn't actually a lot of archaeological evidence for that. What they're examining is things like people's teeth. So we're looking to see what they were eating in the last meal before they died, because those starches remain on teeth even when they're excavated and left, for thousands of years. And they're not finding a lot other than grains. They're finding starch. So they're finding things like barley is a main component of a crop in Pictish Scotland. You also have some wheat that really is relegated for like the upper echelons of Pictish royalty hierarchy, and then the rest of it really is focused on meat, proteins. So there's not a lot of evidence of carrots, of kale, of some of these things. It doesn't mean that they weren't eaten, but we can't say for definite how it was eaten and the place of what we would call kind of vegetables in their diet. But things are focused perhaps on the grains. When we're looking at things like boiling grains, we're looking at things like pottage. Up until very recently, we didn't really believe that they were eating breads. Bannock is a really kind of a staple of Scottish cookery in lots of parts of Scotland. I love a bannock now. And if for people that might not know, a bannock really is another word for bread in Scotland, and the main component is oats or barley or pea flour, really, and it's somewhere between an oat cake and like an Irish soda bread. So it sits in there. It's not as refined as a white loaf or a roll, and it's perhaps not as crunchy as a modern oat cake, but that's what Scotland has eaten for thousands of years. And we know that because now kind of more recent evidence has shown us that they had cairns, which is essentially like a manual, if you imagine like a moon-shaped rock, and they had another kind of stone that went on top of it, and they would put the barley on that, and they would grind it down until it was that finer flour. And one of the main reasons for that is to be able to incorporate it into something, boil it, if you're making a kind of quite a thin porridge, something like a gruel you might imagine, or you're making some sort of bread.
Did you say it was like an unleavened bread? Would it have yeast? Would it be natural yeasts?
Well, we know that they were making beer. So we know that there would have been what we would call like barm, which is the kind of the yeast which comes from the natural part of the fermentation. There's foam that gathers on the top. We know that we use that slightly later in Scottish history as a rising agent. We don't know, really, that's the answer. But we do believe that they were cooking with grains, and we know that the fermentation was happening. So over 600 years, I think you could imagine that those things did go together at some point. But no, I think definitely what we can say for sure is things like, pottages, soups that are thickened with barley, and things that would be served with your proteins, your deer, your cows, things that you were farming, things that you were hunting.
Yeah, much like today.
Yeah.
We thicken soups with barley.
Yeah.
And what kind of evidence do we have about them drinking beer? How do we know that?
We know there's beer because we have the way that when we've done kind of studies on starches and the way they've broken down, and we look at, it's less than a dot of a hair that we're looking at, and we're seeing the way that the cells within the starches are broken down. We can see that there's fermentation there, and so that is coming in kind of tall clay vessels, and we know that it's being fermented into beer. We also know that there's evidence in Roman texts of Pictish ale that's talked about. Again, when we're looking at another culture, another culture that is describing, they might have a vested interest in describing the Picts as barbarians. We can't take everything with a pinch of salt, but they talk about ale, and that matches with what we're seeing when we're digging.
It also tunes into our folklore, because we have that story about the Picts and their heather ale, the recipe for heather ale. The man jumping off the cliff, the story goes, to prevent the Scots from getting the recipe for
Heather ale.
Do we know if is there any evidence to suggest they were using heather for ale?
We do know that your peasantry of the Pictish era will have been using herbs. Things like sorrel, things like heather, things to help perfume or to add to food. If you imagine that all you have for the year is barley, you're going to do everything you can to make at least a meal every so often a bit more interesting. So whether it's mustard seeds to add spice, or it's salt from salt plains, or it's heather or sorrel or nettles you're adding in to help add flavour to develop something. Cooking at the beginning of the Pictish era is relatively established. You know, that's a few thousand years before we got over just kind of throwing animals on fires. And we begin to understand the discipline of cooking food. We don't have recipes, of course, but we do have food culture that begins, and families passing down recipes. And over hundreds of years, as families and communities pass on recipes, things like what herbs to pick, how to prepare soups, how to make a pottage more interesting, all these things are being built into that kind of heirloom food culture that obviously kind of begins to die out once we get to the 9th century.
Going to visit academics and artists and historians, the consensus seems to be that they were very much an oral culture. As you're saying, you know, they're passing things down orally, so recipes, techniques, crafts, all that kind of thing. And I think this is a really fascinating idea, partly because, you know, we still have an oral tradition. And although we haven't yet found a Rosetta Stone, there's quite a few academics who are fairly confident we're not going to find the British Rosetta Stone. But it would be interesting to know that that part of our culture has been with us for a huge amount of time, for such a length of time, that it is part of our cultural identity today. And food is a massive part of that. You know, it's a way of gathering communities together, people together.
We can look at hypotheses that come from archaeologists about what was growing in soil, the acidity of soil. But the problem with archaeology is that because things are in the ground for so long, they're so influenced by what grows on top of them, that it's very difficult to connect those two things, or say that the presence of marshmallow was here in the Pictish era, or did marshmallow grow on top of it?
Yeah, did it just kind of happen later?
Yeah.
I mean, there's two things, kind of. One, when we look at the beaker folk burial beakers, the Achnavanach burial lady, for example, she had a beaker in her burial pit which had traces inside the beaker, and so it was much easier to determine the herbs and also the trees that were around that time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, that's interesting.
Well, one of the things we do know is that one of the most popular barleys, or one of the most ancient barleys that we still have growing in Scotland today, is called bere meal. So it's Bere, bere. And that's still grown in Orkney, and you can still get a packet of bere meal or bere berries from Barony Mill. I've got a couple of bags, and we can still use that today to make bannocks, or to turn into porridge, or experiment with. And I think that's one of the really special things about Scottish food history, is that we still have these really tangible links. Of course, the flavour profiles changes over thousands of years, but the way that starts, the way that grain reacts to water or fire, you can begin to think about your ancestors, or people that have lived, you know, your community ancestors, people that lived in Scotland before your family might have arrived here, to think about what they smelled when a bearberry hits an iron pan, or the way that boiling bere porridge might have smelled in the morning, cooking it over an open fire.
Yes, and I think this is a really important aspect to history, is the fact that there are ways to, you know, taste it, smell it, experience it, in the same ways that, you know, our ancestors would have, or, you know, people hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago would have, because the taste or the flavour or the smell or the experience is pretty much the same.
I think when we can begin to think about food as like a cultural event. And I think especially in Scotland, I'm from the west of Scotland, and I think we struggle with it more than other parts because we're so close to poverty. Either our parents live in poverty, our grandparents live in poverty, or we live in poverty. That's the nature of living in the west of Scotland. Being able to recognise that food can be something more than survival, or that food, like getting past food shame to be able to get to a point of experimenting, it's a privilege to be able to order a £5 bag of bere meal from a specialist mill. But when we can begin to recognise that food is heirloom and food is passed on, that we can re-engage, that when we stand over a bowl and we make a bannock or we make shortbread, we're joining a link of people doing the same thing for thousands of years. For me, I was very much a food writer, modern food writer, up until the point that my last grandparent passed away. And then I began to think about food as a way to connect with my own upbringing, my own childhood. I will never be a woman living through World War II. I will never give birth to children. There's lots of ways that I can't connect to my granny. But she too stood over a bowl, rubbing butter into flour. And that's an event, a cultural event that I can join in and pass.
On some of the stones, there are depictions of certain things which a lot of academics believe now represent weather changes and weather patterns. One of those is the V-rod and the arc.
Mm.
There is a theory that it is almost like an almanac showing the rise and set of the sun and the range through the time.
Seasonality, even up until 100 years ago, was incredibly important to our way of life, because you've got to think there's no shop, and you might be able to preserve some food, but you're relying on what your land gives you at any one time. And for 4 months, our land gives you nothing. There's no winter berries, there's no grains that are going to be sprouting through frost. You're lucky if you get nettles in February. So people are counting down the days until they can begin to harvest, forage. They're looking for the first signs. And so yet they would absolutely have been reliant on understanding the calendar of the year, understanding the weather, looking for signs. We will definitely see mythology around weather and folklore about things that we can do to look forward, or things to ensure a plentiful harvest that we can then eat from through the coldest months.
Which kind of brings me back to what you were saying about the hunting rites and that kind of thing, the idea of ceremony around food and animals, weather, the natural world around us. It really gives this idea that, again, this very sophisticated society that's capable of abstract thought, thinking beyond, this world, the immediate.
And I think we're often shown a vision of the Picts as being people who live in the dirt. The Romans were sophisticated, the Pictish were barbarians. But one of the most recent digs, they found Mediterranean wine in glass, French glasses. Now, they were importers, exporters. They had contact with the Romans. At least we know a lot of it was conflict. But they had Roman jewellery, they had cooking implements that were from around the world. So they're sophisticated people with a monarchy that might look slightly barbarian, or for people that have a vested interest in it, make them look like a barbarian. But they're certainly not. They're certainly not wild beasts.
No, and they were trading. We know that they were trading. If they were trading silver with the Romans, which we know that they must have been trading with other neighbours, all this kind of thing, which is really quite interesting, because if you grow up in Scotland, you know how changeable the weather is, and you know how unreliable things can be, in the natural world, and it's just, I think it's something that actually forms who we are as a people. If you've been smashed around by the weather, you tend to have less hubris, I think.
Yeah. We're a hardy folk, and our ancestors were even hardier, because to live through gale force winds and rain, you had to have been good-natured, because you were relying on your neighbour, that if you ran out of food, they would share theirs. There's a real community in that. And I think, again, I go back to the West Coast and I think about your proximity to poverty and your proximity to isolation, your proximity to death, really, informs a lot of who we are. I think we're a very caring people. We also demand a level of accountability at all times, that we don't want people to be too much up themselves or too into themselves, because that means you're not going to give me when I'm in need.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a driving force for culture in Scotland.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's this idea of like reciprocity. So, you get that within our communities. I give so you can give, that kind of idea. And you get that with a lot of our folklore, with our traditional folklore with regards to when it's an animistic story.
I think we have such unnatural relationships now to birth and death. And we sometimes get a bit floored by it because we put on our suits and ties and modern life.
Yes.
And then suddenly life happens. Someone dies, we lose someone, we gain someone, we become an uncle or an aunt or a father or a mother. And our modern body and brain doesn't know how to compute that. That wasn't the way it used to be. It was so ingrained in the culture. And I think we don't know a lot in terms of the seasonal calendar of the Picts or the way that society and Pictish life would have revolved around these events. But we know that Scotland did have culture, recipes, traditions that were revolved around these points in a life where it's not just seasons, it's the community coming together for whatever it needs to support each other.
I think they would have been very aware of the more visceral elements of our humanity, birth and death. They are very much bookends of our lives.
Yeah. The poetic thing about death and food in the Picts is that the evidence that we have from people's teeth was their last meals, because that's what was preserved and on bones. And so that's when we see things like pottages and stews and porridges. It gives us evidence for what was essentially their last meal. And that's that connection with that end of life of that human being, which I find, in reading it, I find fascinating to think I could recreate what was someone's last meal from 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, that is amazing. That is wonderful. Are you thinking now about recreating the last meal of someone? I do think everyone, if you wanted to recreate a Pictish palate, or you wanted to think about a meal, then you can think about things like roasting will relatively kind of allow you to recreate an open fire, unless you've got an open fire and you can chuck some meat on there. Definitely experiment with venison. I think if you can roast or cook in an iron pan, a cast iron pan, venison, you can add in your starches to really think about. You can get some bere meal from Orkney, or any barley you can get from a supermarket, or oats as well are definitely prevalent in the Pictish era. You can add things like hazelnuts. That was something that abounded as a native in Scotland. And again, we have a lot of folklore about hazelnuts and knowledge, and they are also connected to the salmon. Yeah. And salmon of knowledge. Yeah. So that's interesting. And it's something that can be collected, and they don't tend to go rancid very quickly, especially if they're kept cold. So something you could eat during those 4 months of nothingness, of no harvest. Herbs, there is differences. The herbs mean different things, but if you want to lean in to a Pictish meal, think about combining proteins with some of those starches in herbs, and that will begin to allow you to understand how the Pictish would have eaten. I'll give you a recipe for a bere meal bannock, and you can recreate that with oat flour as well. That's something that's slightly closer to home for lots of people. If you've got a food processor and oats, you can make an oat flour, add it together, and that will replace your bere meal. What would you ask a Pictish chef if you could travel back in time and ask a Pict anything?
I would like to know what fats they use. That's a really important part of cooking. Salt, fat, acid, heat is the kind of 4 components that we've arrived to in modern cookery. And understanding, did they use butter? What was their relationship with dairy? We know they weren't prolific cattle farmers like the Gaels, but they did have cattle. Did they know what to do with it? Did they use buttermilk in their bannocks? Did they create their own butter? Were they trading for oil from Rome? from the Mediterranean when they were getting wine in. Salt. How were they getting their salt? Were they panning salt from salt plains, or was it like the blackthorn sea salt with a tower made of sticks that allowed water to evaporate, leaving salt at the bottom? Those sorts of things. The relationship with ingredients are things that are much more difficult for us to understand, partially because to be able to get that level of detail, we essentially need to dissolve artifacts. We need to crack open pottery and get to the, to be able to understand, is there fat residue 4 millimeters into this 1,000-year clay pot? That we're not going to do that just now. We might find those answers out in the future, but I think if I was to sit down, number one, I wouldn't sit down, I would be helping to cook with. I think that's one of the great things of breaking bread as a way of communicating and sharing community with people. But cooking with someone is a really great way of understanding the human being that creates food. Some people on this earth are called to create food. Lots of them work in restaurants. Lots of them are just mums or dads or people that love to create and give and feed people. And understanding the Picts' relationship with ingredients and the act of preparing food would be fascinating.
It's been brilliant. Thank you so much, Peter.
No, thank you for having me.
Now, there was one thing we didn't talk a lot about in this episode, and that was fish. I've heard many times, as you might have too, that the Picts didn't eat fish. So when I spoke to Professor Gordon Noble, I asked him about that, and this is what he had to say.
It's not entirely true, because we know they did eat fish. It's just a very small part of the diet. So, when you do the isotopic analysis, they'll tell you what the dominant part of the diet is, but you could still be eating, I eat a fish supper once a week. With that, isotopically, it wouldn't really show up in my bone chemistry, which would largely suggest that I'm eating a terrestrial diet, which is what I'm doing. And, we've got lots of direct evidence for fishing in the archaeological records, so sites like Birkhead, we've got shellfish, we've got fish bone, and we've got references in the life of Columba to people fishing and the like as well. So people were, consuming fish and even seals and all sorts of marine life. Vegan. So I wouldn't subscribe to that in terms of being a taboo about fish and the like. It's just something that's fairly standard across Britain and Ireland. Going way back to the Neolithic, there's very little fish consumption. Once agriculture is introduced, it dominates the economy. It's only in the kind of 11th, 12th century and really the medieval period when fish becomes a big commodity, and that's because of growing urban populations and the like. But water and waterways would have been really important to life.
So now we know. If you'd like to have a go at making a Pictish recipe, Peter very kindly shared one with us, and I've added this as a bonus video for this episode. I hope you enjoy it, and if you make it, let us know how it turned out. Pictish bannocks. You will need 240 grams of Birsay bear meal, 120 grams of plain flour, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, 1 teaspoon of cream of tartar, and salt if you want it. Mix these ingredients thoroughly and mix in a little milk, water or buttermilk to make a stiff yet soft dough. Roll the dough out onto a floured surface and use a circular cutter to cut out your bannocks. Cook each side on a hot, ungreased griddle until both sides are nice and brown and the middle is cooked. And enjoy! Special thanks to all our guests for sharing their time, skills and expertise with us. Thanks to Grome House Museum for letting us explore their collections. Huge thanks to Debbie R. Moore for the wonderful sound design, and of course, special thanks to the Heritage Lottery Fund for their support in making this series possible.